The most profound chapter in the story of Australian economic rationalism, however, came with the neoliberal revolution under Hawke and Keating in the 1980s. These two Labour Party leaders impetuously deregulated the whole Australian economy, floated the exchange rate in 1983, and removed controls on international capital flows, without providing adequate controls on foreign investment in Australia. This was all done regardless of the protectionism of our trading partners and apparently without deep thought about the ramifications for the nation's balance of payments. Again, John Stone, as by this time Treasury Secretary, tried to restrain the flamboyant and headstrong Keating, but the juggernaut rolled on. It was effectively economic unilateral disarmament, and Australia became the victim of the gigantic egos of these two Labour Prime Ministers and Whitlam with an even bigger ego. Thus Australia's neoliberal free trade agreements are all failures because we have generally a comparative disadvantage, not comparative advantage, in trade with the USA, Chile and Asian countries, and our economic unilateral disarmament vis-à-vis our protectionist trading partners has left us mercilessly exposed. Starting with Whitlam's 25% across-the-board tariff cut, we have no trade protection left with which to bargain, no leverage left in negotiations. As a result, the coalition now has only our sensitive foreign investment guidelines and precious quarantine regulations with which to bargain with China. We therefore face the prospect of permanent trade deficits and colonisation of our country by foreign nations over time. With regard to the free trade agreement negotiations with China, I refer you to the justifiably pessimistic report of Rick Brown of CPI Strategic, The China Advantage, What Price a Free Trade Agreement with China, which is accessible on Google. Neoliberalism, evolving from neoclassical economics, is based on the classical, confined, free market economics of the Scottish intellectual Adam Smith and the confined trade theory of David Ricardo. However, it misapplies their theories in today's highly corporatized, oligarchical, internationalized economic environment, taking free market theory, including zero tariffs and subsidies, to the extreme. In the process, it incorporates the unrealistic assumptions, pseudo-mathematics, and absurd econometric models of neoclassical economics, adding to them destructive competition policy, harming small business and farmers, and reckless privatization policy. The classic economics of Adam Smith is itself not free from doubt. Smith postulated an invisible hand working through the free market to determine all economic transactions. But as he functioned during the Age of Enlightenment in Europe, which followed the Age of Witchcraft, one might perhaps surmise that the latter surely was the genesis of his at least esoteric theory, perhaps more aptly described as mystical or occult. Neoliberalism is the ideal vehicle for the corporate libertarians of the multinationals, transnationals and internationalist banks, or would-be fascists, especially if they succeed in privatizing the world's finite supplies of water, as they dominate national governments and take control of countries. Neoliberalism, economic rationalism, is also the handmaiden of globalization, which is a force created by an effective alliance between world capitalism, comprising the corporate libertarians of the multinationals, transnationals and the international banks, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, and socialism, including the culturally Marxist United Nations, especially as regards Agenda 21 and Fabian socialism communism. The economies and sovereignty of all the underdeveloped nations, including Australia, and undeveloped nations are threatened by globalism. Australia desperately needs politicians and bureaucrats who are primarily concerned with Australia's national interest, not doctrinaire academic economic rationalism divorced from reality, with its associated globalization propaganda. With regard to globalism and economic rationalism, Mr. Andrew Robb, the coalition government's Minister for Trade and Investment, with his so-called free trade agreements, and particularly the horrifying intended Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, is leading Australia towards economic and strategic destruction in the medium-long term, including what remains of our vital manufacturing industry and our long-suffering agricultural industry. Australia has lost out badly under all our existing free trade agreements, and the free trade agreements with South Korea, Japan and China in their totalities over time will surely be no different in these circumstances. Australia must ask why Mr. Robb is continuing with this course of action, so harmful to our country. Mr. Robb, in the press, has sententiously declared that free trade will be the salvation of the world. I would have thought his job is to look after the interests of Australia, not the world. And you may be sure the world is not much interested in looking after the interests of Australia. Meanwhile, not to be outdone, the Federal Treasury apparently has no objections to the transfer of Australian businesses or their operations offshore. As Treasury has said, this will be in the interests of employees in other countries. How's that for subversive globalisation? Moreover, Federal Treasury and the Productivity Commission apparently have little concern for Australian agriculture, as they apparently see Australian agricultural resources better employed for higher return elsewhere. So much for Australia's politically much vaunted future as the food bowl of Asia. However, the present coalition government has another potent economic rationalist in its ranks. Mr. Ian Macfarlane, the Minister for Industry, has effectively stated in the media that Australia must win the trust of the international traders and investors. Apparently Australia has done something to earn their mistrust. My question is, how far can we trust them, particularly with regard to surreptitious protectionism and dumping, and where foreign investment results in outright or majority foreign ownership of Australian land and businesses? Little protection in the latter regard can be expected from the PAS, which is the Australian Foreign Investment Review Board. Moreover, most lamentable has been Mr. Macfarlane's rather sanctimonious assurance to the media a few months ago that his government has no place intervening in business matters, when this is the very thing the government and bureaucracy should be doing, as the Asian development economies have demonstrated. How convenient it is for Australian politicians, while handsomely remunerated, to absolve themselves by assigning responsibility for national, financial and economic performance to dangerously internationally dominant corporations, and to hide behind a policy of laissez-faire. Clearly, as the Australian economy continues to decline from underdeveloped towards undeveloped status, it needs to be changed from a Western regulated capitalist economy to an Asian-style developmental capitalist economy, making allowance for differences in psychology and institutions, the pragmatic, commercially oriental economic models of the Asians being much superior to our model. By way of explanation, a regulatory state governs the economy mainly through regulatory agencies that are empowered to enforce a variety of standards of behaviour, to protect the public against market failures of various kinds, including monopolies, oligopolies, monopolistic pricing, predation and other abuses of power, and by providing collective goods, for example, national defence and public education, that otherwise would be undersupplied by the private market. A developmental state, on the other hand, intervenes more directly in the economy to promote new industries and to reduce the dislocations caused by shifts in investment and profits from old to new industries. That is, it applies vital industry policy, which regulatory states tend to neglect. This change to a developmental capitalist economy, unfortunately, would require a more centralized and less pluralistic polity, with trade union cooperation, In Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew had to more forcibly co-opt the trade union movement. It would also mean enlightened intervention by the government in the economy, as Asian governments have done so effectively. Thus, the advocacy of Professors David Flint, Anne Toomey and Glenn Withers for efficiently decentralised Australian federal and federal fiscal systems, although I would submit is otherwise desirable, from legal and political points of view, is not desirable from a political economy point of view.